following is a conversation with Gautam Agarwal, neuroscientist and currently postdoc at the Champalimaud Center for the Unknown in Lisbon, Portugal. The conversation follows after this brief introduction. Bem-vindos! O convidado deste episódio é Gautam Agarwal, neurocientista, doutorado pela Universidade da Califórnia, Berkeley. O Gautam está atualmente a fazer um pós-doutoramento no Laboratório de Neurociência dos Sistemas do Centro Champalimaud, em Lisboa. Aproveito para agradecer ao meu amigo Daniel Delerba, que me sugeriu, e na verdade já há algum tempo que queria trazer ao podcast alguém que fosse um exemplo destacado da vaga recente de investigadores estrangeiros a trabalhar em Portugal. Essa é uma tendência, aliás, que por si só dava um episódio. A crescente capacidade do nosso país em atrair alguns dos melhores cientistas em áreas do conhecimento com enorme potencial. A investigação do Gautam no Centro Champalimaud tem passado sobretudo por usar jogos para estudar as diferenças entre a maneira como seres humanos e algoritmos de inteligência artificial procuram soluções para os mesmos problemas. Este método tem o potencial de permitir, por um lado, compreender melhor o funcionamento do cérebro humano e, por outro, ao estudar os mecanismos do nosso cérebro, que se mostram mais eficazes, obter daí inspiração para o desenvolvimento de inteligência artificial cada vez mais capaz. Conversámos então, como não poderia deixar de ser, sobre estes temas, as forças e as fraquezas das versões atuais de inteligência artificial, mas também do cérebro humano, e a comparação entre esses dois modos diferentes de inteligência. E conversar sobre inteligência artificial é, na verdade, um regresso a um tema que já tinha abordado em episódios anteriores, em especial a conversa com Arlindo Oliveira, que gravei logo ao 5º episódio. Durante esta longa conversa falámos então sobre os desafios que subsistem na tentativa de criar inteligência artificial de nível humano, a chamada General AI, mas também no sentido contrário sobre as limitações da nossa própria cognição. A respeito do cérebro humano, que acabou por ser o que nos tomou mais tempo, conversámos sobre vários tópicos, desde o modo como aprendemos, ao papel do inconsciente, passando pelo mistério da consciência, a meditação, o recente interesse da ciência pelas substâncias psicadélicas, os dois hemisférios do nosso cérebro e, mesmo no final, sobre os motivos por que sonhamos. Antes de passarmos à conversa, uma nota rápida, não ligue ao choramingar que se começa a ouvir perto do final, é que estava connosco também o filho do convidado, que tem 1 ano e cuja consciência não é ainda suficiente para ter noção do que é gravar um podcast, o que de resto só lhe fica bem. Gautam.
Yes.
Huh? Am I what, like 99th percentile?
You're 96.3 percentile, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so as I said, instead of me delving into a specific topic right away, maybe it's more interesting to ask you about your aha moments in your research, either related to the brain or related to the way that we can infer from AI the way the brain works. So what was the in these last years, especially in the years you've been in linked to the foundation, what have been the major insights in your research and thinking?
Well, I would say neuroscience for me is a very fascinating field because I think a lot of people who get into neuroscience are somehow inspired by their own personal experience because ultimately many of the things we study are phenomena that we experience on a daily basis. So like one kind of bad joke about, for example, people who study decision making, like me, is that we're very bad at making decisions. And so naturally, when there's something you're not very good at, you want to know how to do it properly.
Exactly, yeah.
And so in that sense, I feel like it differs from areas like quantum physics or astrophysics or let's say mathematics, in that, in a way, we're in an experiment every moment of our lives.
But that's good, right? It means that you can complement the scientific method by sort of a more philosophical method. In there, you're looking inside and treating yourself as something which you can generalize from.
Yeah, and I would say that brings some of us into, let's say, a methodological quandary, which, to kind of unpack that a little bit, science is very much about being able to set something up in a way that you can describe it very plainly to someone else and they can replicate it. So it tends to be very focused on the physical world and how to manipulate the physical world. Whereas when we talk about our experience, often it's very slippery. There can be a lot of biases in how we experience ourselves. So, for example, to kind of give a touch on your previous question, what are some of the moments of insight? I would say there have been many little surprising moments sprinkled in the last 4 years I've been in Lisbon at the foundation, because the foundation is a place where we can engage in many different types of experiments on ourselves and on our subject matters. And so one such one was called descriptive experience sampling. And this is a method that has been devised over many decades by a scientist in the US, in Nevada. And the idea is that you have a little beeper that you wear on you, and it goes off at random moments throughout the day. And at that moment, when the beeper goes off, you are supposed to write down in as much detail as possible the contents of your experience. And the reason that it's done like this is to avoid all of the preconceptions that come to the table when I, as a neuroscientist, try to reflect on my way of thinking or way of experiencing the world. If I have a theory, that's going to contaminate what I have to report to you. And so what he has developed is a procedure where the beeper goes off, you write down let's say a paragraph about what is going on right now. So maybe I'm walking down the street and I have in an English voice towards the left back side of my head that is thinking about the policeman who is looking at his watch. And that can be surprising because we usually don't have the moment to capture that as we're walking down the street. And over time, with practice, with an interviewer, actually, the interviewer probes the description that you write and picks out all the contradictions in what you've described. And over time, over the course of days, you get to the point where you can describe a tenth of a second in half a page. And so this is an example of an experiment that we did at the foundation with 4 or 5 of us, and found that actually different people seem to have very different ways of experiencing the world as far as they're able to report them.
Sorry to interrupt. It sort of links to personality traits, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's, I would say that's one question that we always want to come back to, like, what is the meaning of all this? And when you are operating in such a relatively new space, like if you are a more verbal person, let's say, and your internal voice, let's say, speaks a few words and then pauses and then speaks a few more.
Yeah.
What exactly does that relate to in terms of a personality, which can somewhat be a social construction, let's say? And this guy who developed the technique, he's collected data from thousands of people, and he started to see what he thinks of as tropes in how groups of people think. So one example, I would say it's not standardized, but one theory that he has based on his work is that people who have bulimia, this urge to purge their
They eat
food,
a lot and then they throw up.
Exactly. It seems like that might actually be common or somehow linked to people who think in scattered thoughts. So a part of an idea starts at the back of their head and then moves to the front right of their head. And the bulimia, the purging moment, it allows their thoughts to coalesce. Very controversial, unclear what it means, but this is an idea of how an internal experience might tie it to something that we can all observe.
That's great. That's really interesting. I mean, because you are connecting to completely different things and unexpected. And I mean, there's a lot of way to go there, to go to until you reach sort of a theory that will be able to explain that. And I asked about personality traits because it's a topic which interests me, and I actually have an episode on that. And I always found it interesting about the connection between neurological differences, if you will, and which are like which occur before or below in this construct, and then the end result, which is different personalities, which are not by the way the only. This is sort of conceptual, but you can also talk about different values or different cognitions or different. So it's not all about personalities that have to do with this. I was thinking about actually too, regarding the comparison of our brain, so the human brain, and different types of AI. And there's always the assumption there that there's one thing called the human brain, which is sort of standardized, meaning it's the same between people, which is obviously not the case. And I was thinking whether it is fair to say that we should pay more attention not only to the comparison between AI and our brain, but also comparing AI with knowing that we have different ways of thinking and different ways of building models of the world, or different operating systems among ourselves.
Yes. I think that's a beautiful point, and it's an issue that's at the core of neuroscience in some ways, because I think many scientific disciplines are about finding unifying principles. So, for example, you take physics, like the laws of gas.
Sure.
So you have, let's say, 10 to the 23rd molecules bouncing around this room right now. And we can model what's going on with just a few variables that have to do with the pressure, the temperature, the volume of the room. And in neuroscience, it's unclear to what degree can we make these simplifications, both in terms of the architecture of the brain, in terms of the cells that create the brain, and in terms of the behavioral outcomes of the brain. So as you're saying, can I think of you and me as roughly the same or roughly very different from each other?
Exactly.
Economics would be an example that makes more the assumption, as far as I understand, of a general commonality of behavior.
Which is a big problem for economics, because you can never find a general truth.
Yeah,
right?
And I would say at the same time, to me, it's that's where you almost have to start. You have to establish what's common before you can speak meaningfully about what's different.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And luckily, now that we are borrowing more tools from mathematics, we can think about variability in more precise ways than in the past. So, for example, you mentioned personality. For like the last, half century, if not for actually many centuries, if you look at even like the Hindu tradition, there's ideas of different types of people. And so these ideas of types have come from for a long time. And I would say what's kind of unique about this moment in for example, neuroscience, is that we can tie this kind of verbal, these ideas that we have in verbal senses to more mathematically grounded ways of looking at diversity. And so, for example, there's many studies, including the work that I'm doing and many others around the world, of trying to collect data from tens of thousands of people. And in order to make precise statements that come from mathematics in terms of, for example, types, there's this idea of the big five of personality. And these ideas, I imagine them to actually have quite a lot of truth to them, because a lot of people have thought very deeply about the origins, and you can do various tests to kind of validate them in terms of statistics. If I take the test today and I take it a few months from now, do I get roughly the same thing? But now we need to imagine the map of people's minds, and you can think of that map as a space, and each of our minds can be thought of as a point in that space. And now the whole set of points is, let's call it a cloud of some sort. And now the question is the cloud kind of a nice oval or like a sphere? Or does it have little branches where you have the autistic community in one little
like clusters,
edge? That's very far from everything else. Another kind of challenge in this is that we're very used to thinking of these distributions in low dimensions, so like a line or a plane. And actually, when you start thinking of distributions in high dimensions, very weird stuff starts to happen. For example, the points, you imagine a cloud in 2D, most of the points will be somewhere in the middle of the cloud.
Yeah.
Now you go to 10 dimensions. Let's say, how fast am I talking? How verbal am I? How mathematical am I? Each of these being a dimension. Now all of a sudden, all the points are on the edge of the sphere, meaning that we're all outliers if we're in high dimension.
That's very interesting. And it makes sense to some extent. Talking about this diversity, I think it may be useful to make it more concrete. So let's take, we could take memory, or we can take perception, but for instance, learning. We tend to assume that the human brain is sort of built for learning in a way, and it's actually very interesting to compare that way in the way that machine learning, for instance, works. Machine learning being a specific method of AI, so like the combination of the two words. But it might not be the case, or is it? So do we human beings tend to learn the same way throughout our lives, and especially since we are born, or are there like different softwares, if you will?
Yeah. I wish I really knew the answer to that. But so you're raising issues of diversity that exist across people. So, just in passing, you might have heard, I'm a very visual person, or I'm a very auditory person.
I was alluding to that implicitly.
Yes. And then I think another point that you're making is that in different contexts, we may learn in very different ways. So, for example, if you're sitting in a classroom and you're in a geometry class or literature class or art class, or you're playing football with your friends, there's so much that's very different about each of these environments. So one attempt at formalizing this in AI and in neuroscience is a topic called reinforcement learning. And the idea is that you can summarize all of the ingredients that contribute to learning in a relatively small set of categories. One of them is the states of the environment. Let's say, which part of the football field am I on right now? Another one is the actions of the environment. I can move to the left, to the right, front, or back. Another is the rewards. I get nothing for everything I do, almost, and I get 1 point for making a goal. And just with these relatively small set of ingredients, you can derive agents that are able to perform these tasks. And so the problem is that these ideas, they're evolving very fast, and they're able to do things that have been people a few years ago would think are impossible for AIs to do. It's still a relatively very simple framework. And so how does exactly this apply to a student in the classroom or you on the football field? There's a kind of gap between how we represent formally the knowledge that we provide to an AI that might help us understand your question of how learning is taking place and how you do it in everyday life. And so at the moment, one approach in neuroscience and psychology is to really simplify these situations that humans are embedded in so that we can derive general principles of their learning. And the wager is that if I understand learning with you in a room where you're pressing a button to indicate if option A is better than option B, and you do that 1,000 times, I can gain insights about your learning style that will generalize to everyday life. And that is, at the moment, we can't confirm that just because we haven't pushed the limits of how these experiments connect to what I experience on a daily basis. But I can say that it's amazing how much insight you can get from these simple experiments as far as their implications for everyday life.
The limitation, I guess, there would be that we as adults, we are never learning on a blank slate, right? Which means that if I come here and you put me in front of a TV or of a computer screen, trying to get at a learning process going on, I'm not coming with a blank slate. So I have a life of past experiences and past learning that will be the building blocks of that learning process, right? So that, I guess, that would make it difficult to sort of completely separate the learning process that's occurring there and the cumulative learning process of your life.
Yes. And in a way, I would say the goal right now of a lot of neuroscience work is to be able to make that separation. Can I create a task where your history before entering the room doesn't contaminate the results? As you're pointing out, there might be something very fundamentally important about the history that you carry out to that moment. But as a starting point, if we are to gain any sort of general principle about what a human being is like, let's say on average, then that separation, that kind of compartmentalization of the human in the white box is a very important step. Now, at the same time, I would say the movement towards citizen science that I and various people are engaged in is to say, okay, do we really need to make that assumption of separating the person's history from their experience in an experiment? So, for example, there's studies where you look at a person as they behave in a laboratory environment, and you compare that to data collected using cell phones. So now you download this app, you play this game or kind of gamified experiment on the phone. Do you do roughly the same thing when you're on, let's say, the metro? There's all these voices, you're thinking about 5 other things, or as compared to when you're in a room, there's silence, there's nothing going on. And the surprising conclusion is actually they're kind of similar. And so I think the question that remains is it similar because we aren't looking in a very careful way? Or is it similar because that's all that human beings are, is what you put in front of them really dictates their experience? Yeah,
that's quite interesting. And you have the like in comparing the way we think with the way we learn and the way recent programs of artificial intelligence do it, I think there are quite a lot of interesting insights you can get from there. There's one which was it was very interesting for me to find out, because I don't think a lot of people are acquainted with that fact. Although it can be challenged in light of the caveat I was mentioning before, which is that our brain it's really very, very efficient in learning.
Yes.
Which means that when we talk about all the breakthroughs that AI in recent years has made, it's not mentioned the fact that those breakthroughs happen because a lot of inputs were fed to that AI program, whereas us human beings are able to learn it very fast. The caveat for this is the one we're talking about, which is that whenever we learn, we are not actually learning from scratch, but are kind of adding one block to the thing. There was something which I found very interesting in the paper you sent me about these things, and what they claimed was that even these recent breakthroughs in AI, so machine learning, neural networks. I mean, you actually, if you can explain it, you'll explain it better than me. So these recent developments are actually based on sort of trend finding, whereas the typical human brain functions more under a permanent modeling of the world, which takes less time to get to, maybe less accurate. So may have a lower accuracy potential. So it may well be, and it has been overcome by AI in games like Go and chess for a long time. But it's more flexible. So if things change a little bit, we are able to adapt. Whereas AI has had there are a lot of examples. I remember one about which was like the self-driving cars. If you put a sticker on a traffic sign, like a very small one, it was enough for the car to misapprehend it and take it for, I don't know, a different sign that it was supposed to be. So a very small trick will be able to trick AI.
In a way, like, I think your summary is very accurate in terms of what some of the limitations are. The brain, whether human or any animals, is very efficient. So a lot of the work that is coming out in AI, it's done on these processors that are operating billions of times a second, and they're taking in thousands of images to produce an answer. If we had to put a number on the rate at which our brain is operating, well, first off, it seems to operate at all rates in some sense. It follows kind of a power law distribution, which is you see in the ocean, you have big waves and then you have little waves, and they're all happening at the same time. There's no like fixed clock as you have in the computer. And somehow it leverages information that's coming in at different rates, at different granularities, and synthesizes them into some sort of continuous behavior in a way that can be so efficient that you can learn from a single example. And so that is part of the reason the authors, for example, in this paper suggest is that we're not just gluing a bunch of patterns into some sort of mega pattern that knows how to siphon data in through a series of pipes to produce the right answer, but rather we we distill from thousands of input signals. So imagine even your eye right now, you have little dots, each of which is, let's say, bright or dim or colored or flickering, and somehow you have these thousands of bits of information coming in, and you can hone in on, let's say, an explanation of what's happening in front of you, which is there's this neuroscientist, he's going to say something about AI to me, and it's going to somehow fit into my narrative. You have kind of a story that you're telling that really distills an essence of what's going on, and that story allows you to take new experiences and make sense of them in very efficient and creative ways. And I think that's one of the major gaps right now that people are trying to figure out. And the flip side is that sometimes that's really dangerous. Like, for example, in politics, this comes up a lot, where you have one idea that you hear someone say online, for example. And our learning apparatus is so powerful that you might completely flip a switch in your brain that makes you think about something in a certain way just from one piece of sensory input that isn't grounded in the statistics of the world. So it's both a very powerful and a very dangerous weapon.
The way I look at it is that I think there's an insight to take from evolution, looking at this. So the weight and the size of our brain is an evolutionary mystery, in that it consumes a lot of energy, and it's sort of mysterious how the way we were selected to have large brains. Obviously, we see the benefit of it, but we also see that it takes a lot of energy. So it must have been really very beneficial.
A lot compared to our other organs, and very little in comparison to a computer.
No, sure. Yes, so much less than a computer, but a lot of energy. It consumes a lot of energy in comparison with the other organs. But what it means is that evolution was really very strict in terms of this energy consumption, meaning that the brain would have evolved in a very, very efficient way. So consuming a lot. That's why we have these heuristics. I don't know if you to what extent do you buy that vision of like the two brains. So the sort of unconscious, automatic, heuristic-based brain, which is the one at play in the example you gave, and then the more conscious one that tackles in a conscious but very energy-consuming way a specific problem. The first one, the heuristics one, there must be another name for it, but the one that is at play when we are driving, for instance, so automatically doing something that we already know, that's made to consume very little energy, to be very efficient, but obviously that comes sometimes at the expense of biases, of errors, and that's where that's a problem that AI doesn't have, right? So that there's clearly something that we are at a disadvantage vis-a-vis AI, regardless of our capacity to be flexible. Our fast brain is fast, but it's not very accurate.
Yeah, I would say another kind of surprisingly elusive idea is what is it to be accurate? And there,
I guess,
like if you are asking someone to guess a number between 1 and 10, and you're thinking 5 and they say 7, that's more accurate than 9. That's a fairly well-defined case. In the case of a self-driving car, is it more accurate to slow down? Is it more accurate to drive off the street if there's someone in front of you? And maybe you have an intuition for what the right answer is. But my point is that in everyday life, the concept of accuracy, which is fundamental to machine learning, to training a computer properly, that itself becomes very fuzzy. And that, even though I agree that AIs in certain contexts are far less biased than we are, ultimately any bias they have is completely dictated by the programmer that chooses what it is to be accurate. What is the architecture of this AI? How does it evolve over time?
Sure. Yeah, that's why it works. It has so far worked better in more sort of constrained situations, playing games and task-based situations, rather than in the more complex situations of everyday life, in which AI would need to be able to perform in order for us to get to a general AI state. So general AI versus narrow AI. So general meaning human comparable. I'm asking this because I know that you work a lot on like cross insights between neuroscience and AI. So things we are able to learn about our brain and can use developing an AI, and things we are able to learn from observing, sort of applying the same methods to AI and get those insights to our brain. The limitation there, I guess, is that on the one hand, we know that our brain is still better at a lot of things, like the fact that it builds models that are more flexible, the fact that it is able to imagine different realities, so not just the reality that happens here, that is happening right now, but kind of an alternative reality. I'm able to imagine what you're thinking, a lot of stuff that we are able to do. But then on the other hand, we know about these limitations, so these biases, the limitations even in processing power of our brain. Is it not a huge challenge to be able to reap the insights that may be useful for AI without bringing along the sort of defects rather than characteristics of our brain?
So you're talking in the direction of AI to neuroscience?
No. Neuroscience to AI. So studying, basically, there's a fundamental question here, which is, what's the way to build general AI? So one way is to get inspiration from the brain, which is the only intelligent thinking machine we know of. There's another way, which is going completely around that and building it from scratch based on different principles. But if we follow the first one, so getting inspirations from the human brain, I guess it will be very tricky not to bring along with the good things of the human brain the bad things, if you will. So the defects of the human brain, the shortcomings of the human brain.
Yeah. For me, I guess one challenge in all of this is that we are trying to build something with where the principles of engineering are still not established, and we're trying to get it to solve a problem that isn't very clear. So if you have, for example, you want to build a bridge, then you can you have some sort of objective, which is to cross from the north to the south of the river. It needs to be resilient according to certain constraints. And then you can optimize for these physical constraints to develop a bridge. When you train AI on something relatively straightforward like a game, you know what the objective is. Even maybe for something like a self-driving car, you can say minimize the number of accidents. But therein you start seeing some of the ambiguity of the high-level principle creep in, and this is, I would say, even more so the case for this concept of general AI.
Yeah.
What exactly are you trying to optimize? It kind of goes back to the start of our conversation. Even if you think about your own experience, it's a very slippery concept. Who are you? What are you?
Do you have free will?
Do you know what you are optimizing for?
Sure.
Yeah. I certainly don't know what I'm.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. And so I guess what I've been very interested in is in my own work is to try to come up with environments that are not too simple, because simple environments are easy to solve and can be solved trivially. You don't really need intelligence to solve a very simple problem. but they're not too complex so that you lose sight of what it is that you're trying to optimize. And in a way, we talked about games like, let's say, Atari games or Go as being relatively simple. From a mathematical standpoint, they're actually very complex.
Yeah, sure.
And so...
I think I used the word constrained, maybe not, but that's what I meant. So simple in the sense that not being simple to play, but happening within a constrained set of rules.
Yes.
Rather than in comparison with our life, which is much more complex in a sense. Complex is an ambiguous word, right?
And it's a very relative word.
Yeah.
So a very kind of important concept in AI and the intersection between AI and neuroscience right now is the curse of dimensionality. And the idea there is that even if you start with a very constrained environment where I can only have a controller, I'm playing an Atari game, I can move left, right, or jump. Okay, so that's just 3 actions, big deal. But now every time step, let's say you're playing at 10 times a second, you're thinking about what to do. That's 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. And within a second, you have 5,000 different actions that you could possibly take. And so if your goal is to find the best string of actions, you're searching among 5,000 different possibilities at every moment in time. And that's just if you care about 1 second. And so this is the challenge whereby these seemingly simple games, constrained games, become immensely complex. And so one thing that I've been using is games that are closer to the game tic-tac-toe. I don't know in Portuguese what it might be referred to as. Do you know this game?
It's called Jogo do Galo.
Okay.
The rooster game.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jogo do Galo is kind of Jogo de Gallo. Galo. Okay.
Yeah. No, you pronounce it correctly the first time.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So that is a game that is... much simpler than some of these Atari games. And even there, you kind of get into, if you think of what's called kind of a fitness landscape, there's this concept in evolution, for example, which genes lead to the most fitness. So, and this image of a landscape, the idea is that every point in this landscape represents a different configuration. In one case, it might be, in the evolutionary case, it might be, your genetic makeup. And then the high points of this landscape correspond to very good genetic makeups. And this is also the case in AI. If you're thinking about the possible actions that I can take, I can map out those actions on a landscape, and the high points of those landscapes correspond to the best sequence of actions. So even a game like Jogo de Galo is one where you have actually quite a large landscape, and you have hills and valleys in that landscape. And your goal is to get to the highest point of that landscape, but you need to go through a valley sometimes before you can get to the peak. And that's something that can be a problem for some of the AI systems because they just follow the direction that increases their height. And so when we learn games like Jogo de Galo, we learn that, okay, we need to connect 3 in a row. We abstract away this concept so that it doesn't necessarily have to be the left vertical column. It can be diagonal. It can be going across. And then all of a sudden, we are connecting different disjoint, separate points of this value landscape to the same concept.
That's actually the way our memory works, right? So the way we are able to memorize so many things is by connecting and generalizing a lot of observations into a general principle, right?
Yes, and I think for me, one of the miracles is that the way in which we glue these ideas together sometimes can be very removed from our naive mathematical ways of describing them. So this idea of a landscape, if I just put 1x down, 1 over to the right, or 2 over to the right, it can mean something very different. and put you in very different parts of the landscape, and somehow we're able to glue the right parts of the landscape together.
Yeah.
And so the idea that I've been studying for the last few years is now we also have a landscape as an experimenter of games. So there's very simple games and very complex games. And I think we might agree on the limitations of going too much on either extreme. What is a good middle ground where I can both challenge your intellect, your intelligence, in how you find creative solutions to hard problems, but model it mathematically. Make it such that by looking at thousands of people, I can start finding general principles of, okay, this is a type of person that forms this kind of rule in terms of figuring out how to play this game efficiently. Or maybe there's groups of people who don't form any rules at all. They use more of an instinct.
Exactly.
Already in the lab, when of the people I've looked at, you see people who are very committed to this rule-based approach or vice versa. And but until I get sufficient statistics, I can't really make claims about that.
And it brings us back to what we were talking about before, about personality. For instance, I see myself, maybe I'm wrong, but in comparing with the people I interact with, I see myself as typically someone who learns by establishing general principles. Sort of a big picture sort of approach, if you will. And I think there are people who follow a different approach, so more of a low-level approach in that they use instinct, if you will, or they collect more granular data rather than trying to understand like the overarching principle of the thing you're trying to memorize. So maybe not everyone behaves the same way when learning or when memorizing. Yeah.
And there's the idea from an evolutionary perspective, the so-called term is neurodiversity.
Yeah.
That actually it's good that you learn in a very different way than someone else, because that'll allow you to pick up certain things that they won't, and vice versa.
No, and in real life, it's clearly true. So every approach is, by definition, has limitations. So it's limited by definition, which means that if I think this way and you think in a different way, we'll be able to complement each other because you're looking at something like your approach will be able to get insights that my approach won't be able to, and vice versa.
And I think kind of the opportunity that we have in neuroscience right now, in the kind of intersection of AI, neuroscience, and psychology, is to take this intuition that this diversity is somehow useful, and these verbal descriptions that I think in a more broad way, and there's people who think in a more granular way, can we put some numbers to this? Can I actually can I visualize what your big picture way of learning looks like? Because another kind of aspect of diversity is that we gain very different insights when it comes from a verbal description and a visual or a sensory description. So right now we're engaged in verbal description. What happens if on a virtual reality map, I can project a shape that represents the style in which you learn and compare that to that of other people? I think we'll gain different kinds of insight into this kind of conversation.
Yeah, and the way we memorize too. For instance, I heard something on one of the podcast episodes we were talking about before the conversation that I found very interesting. That this guy was explaining that there are basically two ways in which we memorize. I'm not sure if this is if this was his opinion or whether this is something which is clear evidence. But so the standard way is for us to sort of the long-term memory. It happens by synapses between the neurons, so that are flashed, and then when we flash them again, we remember things. And there's another way for the working memory or short-term memory, when you have to memorize a phone number, for instance, in which it happens in a different way. It happens at the level of neurons isolated, I think. So rather than, it has more to do with, I'm stepping to uncomfortable terrain here.
Go for it.
For my knowledge, but it happens at the level of neurons rather than at the level of synapses, and it's by definition short-term. So if I ask you to memorize a 10-digit number, you're able to do it. But then if I ask you again for it tomorrow, you won't remember it, or would I? Because you are working with your short-term memory that's sort of short-lived.
Yes.
Is this correct or?
Yeah, and so the concept of short-term and long-term memory, I think, is a very useful way of categorizing different styles of learning. Now, it turns out that there's actually learning seems to also be one of these things that's happening on every time scale. So if you look at cellular processes, you have activity at the synapse that starts, let's say, with an action potential, which is a 1 millisecond event. And that causes the release of neurotransmitters over the course of tens of milliseconds. And that invokes calcium responses over hundreds of milliseconds, which invokes changes of configurations of proteins and chemical tagging over the course of seconds that can lead to gene expression over the course of tens of seconds or minutes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you end up with years.
Yeah.
So I would say the terms short and long term are colloquially useful, and they invoke a multi-scale biological process at all time scales, and possibly is another example of the diversity that we were talking about in the expression as expressed in learning, where if you really dissect the different phenomena involved in learning, you might end up with way more than two categories that fall on one dimension. As we said before, is muscle memory on the football field the same as cognitive memory as established when thinking rationally, for example, even if they're at the same time scale?
Sure. No, and that ultimately it's really hugely complex. So, for instance, in the brain, as you were alluding to, there are a lot of things happening at the same time, and I guess it's not easy, or rather, it's almost impossible to separate everything and be able to pinpoint what's the origin of these memories, for instance, or something else. But memory for me is actually it's quite fascinating. I've thought a lot of times about that because I'm always puzzled by the way. And I guess everyone is. By the way, there are some things we forget within months, and other things that stick to our memory. For me, it's a big mystery. I have one theory that it would be cool to have your take on. I think it has. Well, this is sort of obvious. It has to do with the importance we give to it, but it's more the unconscious importance we give to something. Say I'm reading a book. So I could read the book into parallel realities. One of them I'd be reading the book at the beach, for instance, or in a sort of relaxed, non-committed way. And in the other reality, I'll be reading the book in preparation for this conversation. What happens with me, and I have a lot of data points for this, is that in this second situation, I'll remember much more a year from that day. It happened, for instance, I was looking at the note I had taken for, the other conversation I had related to AI for the podcast, which happened in, I think, October 2017, so more than a year ago, and I remember a lot of that stuff because I was reading things that were useful for me in the short run, and sort of my unconscious was committed to that learning process. But I'm not completely sure of this insight. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does. One thing I'm curious about is what is the advantage of reading on the beach? Like, what might be better in that scenario for you? Like,
no, it's worse. No,
I see what's worse about it, but are there any advantages to reading on the beach?
It's more relaxing. So I think that the second scenario yields ultimately longer term memories because you're using more resources in that scenario than in the first one. So reading in the relaxed way is cool, but you're not taking as much from it as you take the relaxation from it, but you do not take the insight. It's sort of it's analogous to that principle which became known from Malcolm Gladwell book. It's called Deliberate Practice. You know that thing about the 10,000 hour rule. It's I'm pretty sure it's much simplified, but it has to do with, like, the deliberate word that comes before practice is quite important there because it means that you are, well, to summarize it means that you need supposedly 10,000 hours to be proficient at something. But that doesn't happen just by you doing that. It happens by you doing that in a deliberate way. So you are completely committed to doing that. The full resources or the full potential of your brain is committed in doing that, rather than just reading for fun or playing guitar in an uncommitted way. So this is more of a psychological insight. But I don't know if this has been sort of proved that in a more neurological way of analysis, so analyzing the brain rather than like the unprocessed.
The kind of I guess the closest phenomenon that I can think of is that of attention, and that people have studied scientifically, both psychologically and in neuroscience, and there seems to be kind of varying effects of paying attention to something. One is that, let's say I'm paying attention to my visual experience more. That can raise the activity of certain neurons. It can make them more respond in higher fidelity, which means that if I show the same object 10 times, the neuron will be more consistent in how it responds to this object each of the 10 times when you're paying attention. And also, as you're saying, it can increase the learning associated with it. The idea is, I think, also related to that of limited resources. So at the end of the day, you have all of this information coming in. How do you choose which of it
ignore and which of it is
relevant? Yeah. And I guess coming to yet another mystery is, why does it have to be conscious? Like, why couldn't it be something that your body does automatically? Why does it seem to be tied to your conscious awareness of what's going on?
So you want to talk about consciousness? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I've been itching for that conversation for some time.
Okay, so I'll make the introduction. I think it's a great segue for that. It's a topic I love, actually, and because it relates to. It may be a limitation of AI. We never know, because it's very hard to define consciousness. For me, it's natural to recognize it. Although being an emergent process, it's something that's, for instance, I've heard some people from the AI world claiming that the expression was that consciousness will be explained away, meaning that I think the way I interpret it is that it will, at the end of the game, it will disappear, basically, because it's something very diffuse that's not actually there. It's just the effect of different things. For instance, Dan Dennett, the philosopher, I love a lot of his work, and the way he defines it is that consciousness in the way of comprehension. So really, the fact that we understand what we are doing here, and we tend to look at at least the AI systems we have so far, as not understanding what they are doing. So in doing it in a mechanical way, but not having awareness. He says that comprehension / ultimately consciousness comes after competence. So it's an effect of competence. So if you have, in our evolution, we gain competence, and this is kind of the byproduct of competence, and nothing more than that.
I suppose that's probably one thing that I find very interesting about it as a topic, is that, we all have some sort of a lot of us identify with our own conscious experiences, and as a community, a scientific community, there's no consensus on what it is, and so it's both incredibly accessible and universal, and incredibly elusive at the same time. So from the neuroscience perspective, I would say a lot of what we do comes from the very physicalist stance. Generally, I think many neuroscience, at a community level, we operate on the principle that the brain is a physical machine, let's call it, and that any expression that we are capable of or experience is ultimately a side effect or an outcome of the workings of that physical machine. I would say that, it is a good working premise in terms of how we conduct our experiments. To me, it doesn't get any closer to answering the mystery that has confronted our cultures for thousands of years, and in fact has been talked about in very sophisticated and diverse ways in many different communities, let's say including religious practices, and including art, I would say. There's certain levels of insight that I would say they have to offer about that process that come from very different places. Philosophy is another example. So if you talk to, or some philosophers categorize the different stances on what consciousness is, and most scientists fall into one corner of that space of possibilities. Let's call it the physicalist, monist, reductionist corner. Then there's the mental monists who think of experience as being the primary phenomenon. So, many of us grow up in this working premise that, okay, this is what I touch, this is the physical world, we can create devices, we clearly have some sort of control. If something happens to me in the physical world, I will pay for it. All of these things lead us to assume that the physics is first. If you're coming from a more Buddhist perspective, it would be actually the experiences that I have right now, which are a very mental thing, are what's first. And what I find really fascinating about that approach is that actually that can be seen as a science too. There's many terms of different flavors of attention or different flavors of emotion. There might be many dozens of terms that have been created by that community that can really take this seemingly nebulous construct of experience and really partition it and also operate on it in systematic ways. If I'm in this state of desire, how can I go from this state of desire to one of acceptance? And there's in terms of mental experience, they might be quite far removed from each other, but there's a certain discourse around a systematic way of going through that space. And so one kind of more recent development that I'm very excited about is the conversations that are going on between these different communities. So even the Dalai Lama has gotten involved in conversations with neuroscientists where there's camps, neuroscientists going to teach monks about ideas in neuroscience and vice versa. And the hope is that there might be some cross-fertilization in that.
Yeah, and there are a lot of insights that have been gained from Buddhism and meditation, right? So from being able to sort of observe your own consciousness removed from it, in a sense, right?
Absolutely. And, I think one thing that I find to be very missing in the physicalist approach is that it can rob our lives of meaning in some way. There can be, if everything is a cause and effect chain of atoms bouncing around and influencing other atoms, that can be somewhat of an alienating experience. And I think spiritual traditions, they can offer psychological mechanisms that allow us to operate in the world in a way that gives us more agency over emotions. And so in that sense, I think in a functional sense, it's very useful. And it actually gets at some of the issues that neuroscientists are very interested in, for example, emotion. So in that sense, even though these ideas are coming from a very different place, they might have these systematic insights that we can borrow.
How do you view emotion, by the way? What's your well, this may seem like a basic question, but what's your because it's a word that's used for so many things. What's your take on it in human cognition?
So right now the strongest association in neuroscience with emotion is that of neuromodulators. So these chemicals that include, for example, serotonin and dopamine and adrenaline and acetylcholine, they seem to have centers in the base of our brains composed of these neurons that sprout and connect throughout the brain. And at certain moments, let's say moments of surprise or moments of reward, they become active and release, they seem to bathe the brain in a certain neuromodulator in ways that seems to correspond to emotion. One of the strongest connections that has been established is between dopamine and the experience of reward. And so it seems like
It's connected, sorry to interrupt, it's connected to the learning process we were talking about, right?
Exactly.
As a reinforcement mechanism of the learning.
That's right. And so it seems like there's been a lot of progress. I would say the story is probably much more complex, as any story is. And so, for example, is dopamine always linked to these particular emotions? What if it is a reward that you're ashamed of, for example? There's all these contingent emotions that, like, for example, certain writers might be very careful in describing. And I would say the current map that we have in neuroscience that connecting neuromodulators to emotions doesn't quite capture.
This came up to my mind now because we were talking about the Buddhism and that leads to meditation. What's your view on being able to sort of alter the way your brain behaves from the outside? So we talk about thinking, intelligence, ultimately consciousness as emergent processes that emerge from your brain activity. But one thing Buddhism and meditation tries to do is to also reverse that. So sort of by meditating, for instance, you're able to alter the way your brain works, and this can work to reduce anxiety, for instance, is one of the applications. As a neuroscientist, how do you view that?
Yeah, well, we, a bunch of my colleagues and I, we started a meditation working group. We met for about a year or so, invited a teacher, and went through the experience, focused on mindfulness, in fact, inspired by a cognitive scientist, Mark Williams, I believe, who gave a talk at our center. And I would say, like any community, well, science is definitely a community where we face emotional challenges on a daily basis, in the sense that we are working towards a goal which might not produce viable results for years. And so it might be no surprise that there's actually a lot of mental health issues in the scientific community. Graduate students experience a lot of anxiety and depression. And so there's a little bit of an irony in that the field that studies the brain, a lot of its practitioners have these problems, in a sense. And I would say I'm very much someone who's had to cope with these experiences in the uncertainty of the scientific enterprise. And so I would say
every field which has uncertainty is related with challenges, with emotional challenges. So that's why every creative field, for instance, if you are writers, painters, they're all people who typically have to fight cases of depression or anxiety, because you live in an uncertain world, being it related to artistic creativity or to scientific research. In your case,
yes, and I think uncertainty, moments of challenge where it's not uncertain, it's like definitely bad, for example. These are all cases where I'm certainly at a personal level very curious about what meditation has to offer. And in a way, it from a neuroscientific perspective, it's fascinating, because at least the implication for mindfulness is that just by paying attention, not trying to do anything about it, it might actually help you achieve a certain goal in terms of your emotions, or as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, it's very puzzling to me. I have tried meditation only a few times, but I have to say not very deliberately to pick the word I was using before. So I wasn't able to gain those insights yet, but I've been very curious about it. And meditation, it's only one way of accessing consciousness. we talked before the conversation about something which I also find very interesting, which is the case of psychedelics. So being able to access your consciousness in a way, maybe in a quicker way, I would wager not in such a profound way. Maybe I'm not correct, because meditation occurs, like, for you to reap benefits of meditation, it takes a lot of time. It takes really a long time, and the benefits get higher and higher the more you do it. But they only start happening, I think, within weeks or even months. Whereas psychedelics are an immediate thing. And first, I was puzzled because I saw a lot of unsuspecting people talking about that. So philosophers, scientists. I mean, Sam Harris, for instance, who is a guy whose podcast I listen to a lot, and even a very stern guy in a sense. So in the sense that he's not very outspoken. So and he was talking about that and gaining a lot of insights from that, and especially psychedelics being one thing that is typically, at least in Portugal, frowned upon. So it's basically it's treated in the same way for the common folk. I guess it's treated as if it were strong drugs, or even or not so strong drugs, but it's treated in the same way. Whereas in this field, it's seen as a way of getting a lot of insights from your consciousness.
I think it's a very profound vehicle. It's one of the cases where a specific molecule, which is a physical entity, can induce a very profound, a very intimate, and a very universal experience, allowing two very different people from two very different backgrounds to develop a language about very internal insights.
And it happens by, as I get it, it happens by sort of turning off parts of the brain, right?
Yeah, it's really hard to say what exactly is going on. It seems like we're in a time period where after about a 40-year drought, there are more scientists around the world working on the exact mechanisms and the implications of psychedelics. And the current studies suggest that, at least for certain psychedelics, parts of the brain, their activity is greatly reduced. Now, what that means is quite unclear.
Yeah, the way I see it, but I'm obviously a layman, so so this might be completely wrong. But the way I see it, some parallels with dreaming, because in the way I interpret my dreams, and I was actually talking with friends about this today, it's as if a part of my brain is turned off. So for the part of the brain which checks the plausibility of things, that at least is turned off. So very strange things happen in my dreams that are not plausible, and in real life I would find that they were not possible right away. And in dreams you can go on having a dream that it's implausible until you wake up, and I would guess that happens because a part of your brain is turned off, but maybe it's a bit more complex than that.
Yeah, and I think part of the complexity arises from what does it mean for something to be off. So when we think of something being off, often it's in terms of a switch being off. That means there's no electricity going. It tends to be kind of a neutral state. In neuroscience, off actually is a much more active concept in a sense, because something that's on is only meaningful in far as it turns off sometimes. And so those states of offness can actually convey a lot of information.
As much as being on.
Yes.
Right? That's what I mean. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes complete sense. Let me try and close this topic of consciousness. There's one thing, there's one way I know neuroscientists have been trying to study another aspect of consciousness, which is the sort of the theory of the mind-based one, being that, I think I'm summarizing this correctly. So it has to do with the fact that I'm able to anticipate what you're thinking and to anticipate your behavior in a situation I'm witnessing from the outside. And there's this really very, very interesting experience with kids, at least, and I hope to do that with mine, because I find it very funny, which is that you're able to basically until they are 3 or 4 years old, they are not able to understand that someone may not be seeing, may not be aware of what they are seeing. So if someone enters a room and if we know that if someone wasn't inside this room when I hid an object, we know that person will not be able to find the object. A kid under 3 or 4 years old will not know that because he or she is not able to put he or herself in the other person's shoes, and that's a feature of consciousness. So it's one of the aspects of consciousness for me to be able to know that I'm aware of something. You can be aware of it too, but our two awarenesses are different. That's one aspect of consciousness which you can study directly, I think. And like the other ones, that's what I mean. So this is because it changes with one getting older. So you can study a kid as he evolves from state A to state B of consciousness in this regard.
And what would you say we could learn from that? And let's say, so the child gets this theory of mind, like what could you say about consciousness from that, or anything else?
No, you could say maybe how it emerges from the brain. So by studying the way the brain changes from, let's say, 3 to 4 years old or 4 to 5 years old, you'll be able to ideally pinpoint the origin of that change in consciousness.
Yeah.
This is probably much more complex than that. Yeah.
It makes me wonder, for example, is it a change at the level of physiology, connectivity, or is it a conceptual change, a change in the rules through which you view the world, which might be a type of change that is much harder to detect?
Okay, I would say my bet would be that it happens at the level of neurophysiology, so at the level of the actual brain, because if it was merely conceptual, it will not happen at the same age with everyone.
I don't know if it happens at the same age with everyone, though.
Maybe it doesn't.
Because at least my limited experience with my 1-year-old is that there's a little bit of fuzziness in terms of the exact time. What seems to be, I don't know, like, and once again, this is kind of anecdotal with seeing him. There's kind of a chain of events. Like first, I learn how to crawl, and then I learn how to prop myself up. There's these kinds of antecedent behaviors that open the door for the next behavior, and so, you know, I guess what you're saying raises the question with any behavior that a child goes through, is it the same sort of thing? In terms of your point about this theory of mind, to me, one issue with that is that it raises this distinction between the so-called easy and hard problems of consciousness. Have you heard of this?
No, I'm not aware of that. No.
So it's this guy, David Chalmers, came up with this notion to try to distinguish ways in which we think about consciousness. And what he's saying is that many of the phenomena that we ascribe to consciousness actually fall into the so-called easy problem, which is more functional in the sense that it's you can train an AI to say that, okay, now you can have an AI that has a label, a flag that it raises every time it is confronted with another agent that is in the room and having the same experience. So you can train a system that responds to sensory input to produce a certain behavior. And many of the things that we do and that we're capable of actually fall into this kind of easy problem of consciousness, which is ultimately a cognitive issue. And what he thinks of as the hard problem is the phenomenon of a certain sensory experience. And so I'm curious about your views. Do you see this theory of the mind? To me, it seems like it could be seen as more the kind of easy rather than the hard problem. But I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked my opinion because I'm the layman here. But I think I would put it in the first one too. And actually, I've heard about that before. I just heard it by different names. So the hard one was called phenomenological, and the first one had a different name. I don't recall. But yes, and actually, I think most of the time when when we talk about consciousness in a more philosophical way, we are talking about the second one, about the phenomenological one. It has to do with like human experience and sort of you reflecting upon your own experience, rather than the first one, which is more of a more operational one, if you will. This theory of the mind might be between I think it's kind of a bridge between the two of them, so that's why it makes sense for it to occur when we are growing up, so during our development.
Do you think babies are conscious in the hard case?
I was going to ask you about that.
Okay.
I don't know, actually. I don't know whether babies are conscious. I don't know. I have no idea when we started to be conscious. So we human beings. So there's a theory that it happened actually not too long ago. So it happened like with the agricultural revolution, and that would tell us that it's more of a software-based thing than a hardware-based thing. For instance, are dogs conscious? I don't know. What do you think?
I would place money on yes, but
it depends on what we define, right? I think they clearly are. They clearly have emotions, so they have that clearly. They do not have this higher level of consciousness of being able to think about themselves and to reflect, because they are not their brains are not developed as that. But they and if you go from dogs are not even the most intelligent beings below human beings. But if you start from human beings, monkeys, dolphins, going on dogs, and then going all the way down, where's the border between soft consciousness and no soft consciousness? It's very tricky. And
yeah.
There are a lot of ethical challenges there. Because, for instance, if one decides to be vegetarian because we don't want to hurt conscious beings, implicit in that is our judgment of which beings are conscious and which beings are not. So that's all very tricky. I find this very fascinating, this whole topic of consciousness. So I'll close this one. So I think we've talked enough about consciousness.
We almost figured it out.
Yes, we did nothing like that. That's would be expected. Let me go back to the. Let me try and close the other two topics we were jiggling with. So if I can do it, if I can classify them this way. So one more about the brain and the other more about AI and the comparison with our intelligence and the way the human brain thinks or operates and the way AI has done so far. So on the first one, there are some doubts I've always had, and I cannot. I mean, I would be stupid to let it go away without asking a few questions about the brain. I found very interesting. So one of them, I heard one neuroscientist, I think, talking about this once, and it had never occurred to me, which is, why the hell do we have two hemispheres in our brain?
Oh, wow.
I mean, why having a bridge when you could have the two cities merge?
Yeah. So, in English you call it the cheeky answer. I don't know what you would call it in Portuguese.
I have no idea.
The kind of very simplified answer is why do we have two hands? But I would say a more serious answer would be, in a way, related to the utility of off. And actually, there's a neuroscientist, Giulio Tononi, who has developed one of the few quantitative models of consciousness. So to try to give a prediction of a number associated with the degree of consciousness of a system.
Which consciousness, broad sense, or type A or type B?
Good question. I will not answer that for the moment because I don't know.
Okay.
But
it's not too important. All right.
It could tie to both, though. And what he says is that imagine that a system is a bunch of nodes, and the nodes are connected in a certain way. If you don't have many connections across these nodes, then the system is stupid. You don't have any potential to generate some sort of group intelligence. On the other hand, if the system is completely connected, every node influences the others very strongly, then it's also stupid. It's the equivalent of a seizure. Everything is going on and off together.
It has no criterion.
Exactly. You need boundaries, or you need disconnectedness in the system for it to be useful. And likewise, one phenomenon that seems to exist in the brain, both at the level of hemispheres and the level of different regions, is the specialization, the ability to actually segregate the activity in one region from another. So you might have heard, for example, language is more specialized in the left hemisphere, for example.
But is that true? So I always had that curiosity. Is that an oversimplification to talk about the left, for instance, left brain, the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, or does that have actually a neurophysiological basis?
Yeah. I think to me it's a real puzzle, this idea of the global nature of the brain versus the local nature of the brain. And there's evidence supporting both. So, for example, you can have strokes in relatively specific regions, people who are undergoing surgery and have certain areas in Broca's damaged in one hemisphere can have very severe effects. So in that sense, the brain is very local. At the same time, if you look at the activity of the brain, let's say in response to a word or an experience,
happens everywhere, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so the closest kind of analogy that I've come to make of all of this is something along the lines of once and again, I'll risk oversimplification, but cities in a country. So you take the US, for example, you have all of these cities that operate in roughly the same way, like Los Angeles, DC, New York, a bunch of people consuming a lot of energy and sending out a lot of products. But each one of these cities has a certain specialization: politics, finance, art. And they gain something by this kind of segregation while actively participating in this network. So that's the way I'm thinking about it now. In fact, I think one of the current trends in neuroscience and draws a lot from mathematics is ways of thinking quantitatively about highly connected large systems. We are, for the first time, in a position to record from thousands of neurons the entire brains of certain creatures to produce data when every single neuron is active or inactive, to really get at this issue of what exactly is the utility of segregation, what is it to be functional. In a way, just because I damage something and it prevents you from speaking doesn't mean that it's causing your speech. It just means that it's a critical point in this whole network.
We've done that with worms, right?
Yeah. The story that I've heard, at least, is that the worm is kind of a so-called solved system, at least at the level of connectivity.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now, creatures like the worm are very notorious because, once again, for evolutionary reasons, they're heavily multiplexed, meaning the same connection can release multiple chemicals at different time scales. And so just because you know where a connection is, especially when the creature is really small, as far as we can tell, it doesn't actually give you much insight in terms of the functional nature of that interaction.
Yeah, that's very interesting. In our case, as human beings, that there's another aspect which I haven't heard it mentioned, I think, anywhere when talking about AI. But one specificity of our body and of our nervous system is that it is not circumscribed. It's not only in our head. So we have our nervous system extends to the rest of our body. So we have neurons in the rest of our body. I mean, despite this, is it fair to say that we only think inside the brain, or can we actually extend the thinking process towards the whole body?
Yeah, and can we extend the thinking process across bodies? Like, for example, in this conversation, we are to some degree controlling each other's thoughts and influencing the direction of where you're going to go. In terms of what you raised, I think The gut is a good example. Like if you look at
I was thinking about the gut,
Exactly. It's heavily innervated. And I think many of us have had the experience when we're nervous that we feel something that seems to come from this region. Another thing that I imagine with training, one can get more access to as well. But in some ways, I feel like your question goes back to this philosophical depth of, what is thought and, what is the substrate of thought?
Yeah, I imagine that. No, but I was thinking in this case, let's say, so we talk about the case of having a stroke or or having your brain damaged, and sometimes that can change the way you behave. Could we say the same thing about the gut, for instance? So having some damage to your gut, would that feed into a different behavior, or is that only the receptor? Is that only at the receiving end of your cognition, or does that feed into your cognition too?
Yeah. Well, I've heard ulcers are very painful and distracting. So that would be kind of a gross example. But then more recently, there's also a lot of discussion about the microbiome. The community of bacteria and other microorganisms that live in your gut that apparently can influence your mood. A lot of microorganisms interact with some of the same neurotransmitters that we do. They metabolize many of the same molecules we do. So to me, it's no surprise, and I'm really looking forward to where that goes. It could be a very deep and profound level of effect. Like, does it influence the kinds of thoughts that I have, like happy thoughts, sad thoughts, deep thoughts? It could be influenced by this.
No, and actually, this is a good segue to go back to AI, because one of the things I've heard as being one of the limitations of AI, and this sounds like a very trivial thing, but it's the fact that an artificial intelligence program doesn't have a body. Meaning that there's no way to interact with the environment. We are, to a large extent, the way we learn by interacting with the environment. So we learn by we have five senses, obviously, and we interact with each other, and we need a body to collect the data points of those experiences, which then will feed into our learning process. And if we don't find a way to feed an AI system that's analogous to this, maybe that's a huge limitation, right?
Yeah, and in fact, many practitioners of AI, they spend a lot of time thinking about what is the right way of representing the input and the output. So the same architecture can do very well or very poorly depending on how you massage the inputs and the outputs. And as you're alluding to, there's a lot of intelligence at the level of our sensory motor effectors. So for example, the eye, it has all of this adaptive optics that is very precise, and many of the senses, they respond at these physical thresholds. So for example, the ear can detect sounds that are basically at the level of atomic vibrations, or at room temperature. So just fluctuations, thermal fluctuations.
Our ear?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. And so in that sense, at the level of the musculature, the muscles have all of these kind of elastic properties that allow, for example, a cat with no connection to its brain walk on a treadmill. There's a certain springiness to our bodies that allows itself to stabilize in a certain way that might make the computational problem that the brain is solving much simpler in a sense. Now, we've learned a lot from physiological studies, and you can try to input that into the so-called reinforcement learning environment I was describing earlier, as a set of filters that kind of transforms your data. But one thing that I believe the embodied AI research community is finding is that they learn, when they try to put an AI in a body, they learn all of these unanticipated aspects of physics that are very fundamental to the problem that weren't seen before.
Yes.
And you only discover them when it's too late.
But have they done that?
Well, in the sense of robots that have like towel folding robots, things like that. If you try to make a navigating robot, often you'll find various aspects of how it collides with objects, or certain types of surfaces like carpets, for example, that we might take for granted, may represent a certain challenge that you don't think of until you implement it.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. We've covered some of the limitations that are usually mentioned in terms of AI converging with human intelligence. And this is very funny because when we say converging, we're not talking actually about converging. But if that ever occurs, it will obviously surpass human intelligence, because if everything is in place, as we mentioned before, the processing power of a computer is so much larger than our own that it will obviously surpass. So this is kind of a binary thing. There will ever be equivalence between human and AI. Either AI is below or AI is above here, which is a funny insight curious insight from all this. But another aspect that's a very colloquial one that's often pointed out is the fact that AI lacks common sense, what you can call common sense, which is funny because we talked before that AI in these very complex, in one sense of the word, games completely beats the hell out of us. So in Go, in chess, especially if you go to more simple games, we lose in every round. But then there's some degree of what we call common sense, and the word common tells us that everybody has that, regardless of the IQ of the individual. They have it, or most likely they have it. And AI then lacks that. So what's that if not complexity? So it's again, the word complexity is very tricky to use in this regard. But one case could be the traffic sign example, or I don't know. There's another example which is, I don't know if that can be called common sense, but when let's say I used a word with a letter which is halfway between an A and an H. If I use that letter in two words, in the first word it's representing an A, and in the second word it's representing an H, you will get what I'm writing, and I will obviously get it. No problem. For AI, that's very tricky because they are the same word. I'm not sure that qualifies as common sense.
Sure. I mean, what you're referring to is kind of a sensitivity to the context in which an experience happens. One aspect that to me is intriguing is that we are judging AIs in a human world, and like what would happen if we judged humans in an artificial world? Would the opposite happen? Would we lack the so-called common sense of this digital world? And in fact, a very cool study that has been done more recently is looking at AIs and humans play video games. Mm-hmm. And as we were saying before, it takes a while for humans to learn, or AI to learn how to beat these games. But what this group did is that they took a game and they replaced all of the familiar characters with a scrambled set of pixels. And now you get the human to play the same game. Or they took very basic assumptions that we make about physics, such as if I move to the left, I'm going to end up in the next pixel. They scrambled physics. So now if I move to the left, I could end up totally a different place of the screen. And so now, as far as the AI is concerned, all of these are the same because it's just getting patterns and making sense of those patterns. So it does equally well. And all of the privilege that we get from our common sense by playing games that other humans have designed who share our architecture, we lose all that instantly as soon as some of these agreements are taken away from us.
Yeah, because they come from our world. That's one problem in learning. For instance, if one studies these very fundamental branches of science, such as physics, for instance, there's part of the way in which you can do intuitively. So going back to intuition. But then at some point you have to do it only by using mathematics. And that gets very, very unnatural for us because our brain is that's why it's so easy for me to explain things to you and vice versa by calling your intuition and giving common examples or telling an anecdote or telling a story. but mathematics it's very unnatural to us. So we can use it when we go from intuition to mathematics, but the way back is very tricky for us human beings.
Yeah. What I find curious is those cases of people who study things like mathematics, which, as you're saying, is very abstract, but they study it for decades.
Yeah.
And it seems like those people, some of them at least, they develop a certain common sense about that. They can even visualize what is it to be in 5 dimensions, or what does it mean for information to propagate in this kind of network. They have a kind of felt sense about these things.
No, that's what I'm pointing at. I think there's, even when we are abstracting mathematically, we always need to have a substract that's intuitive, and those like very, very good and very how can I put it? A very, very developed mathematicians. They probably build their own intuitions, as you were alluding to, and it might be interesting to study them, so to understand how they have built intuitions to think about realities that don't exist even in the real world, but they even those realities, they felt the need for them to be able to think about them and to process that information and to understand it. They needed to build their own intuition, so their own kind of imagined realities, to understand that even in those extreme scenarios.
And it seems like some of these properties might be due to the architecture of the brain itself. So there's a project which follows exceptional mathematical ability over the development of children to adulthood. And you see that actually some of the signs for mathematical genius can be seen in people at the age of 10 or so. So even at that age, there's something going on in these people that will facilitate their brains towards these exceptional mathematical abilities. And that suggests to me that it might be somehow the architectures of their brains. That
I think I'll finish this.
Yeah, there's a restless brain that is eager to consume the world.
Think what? One interesting example about that common sense and context of we were talking about, it was given by a very well-known philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. I never know if I pronounce his name well. When he talked about a thing called, his concept was family resemblance, which I find very interesting. It can be applied to a lot of things. His example was games. So we all know what a game is, but there's no single common feature across games. So you cannot say that the game is about scoring points, because there are games that are not about scoring points. You cannot say that the game is about being faster than the other, because some games are not about that. You cannot say that games are about playing in a team, because some games are not about that. But in the end, we all know what a game is, because there are some family features, as he call him. So that, I think that relates to the common sense. But anyway, so we are wrapping up with our new guest from this last segment of the conversation. We'll go to the book, but let me just ask about something I was about to forget. I cannot let you go as a neuroscientist without asking this. Why do we dream? It's a very simple question, but I think it has always been a puzzle evolutionarily. But even for someone who studies the brain, I think you may have some insights on this. I mean, why being asleep for 1/3 of the day? So why could our brain work without us sleeping?
That's another one that I would say at the level of what is consciousness. It's a very hard problem. It is one that I would say is maybe a little more accessible than the consciousness problem in a way. One idea is that dreams are, from the neuroscientific perspective, one idea is that dreams are ways of synthesizing information. So you get a lot of sensory evidence, and it can be kind of piecemeal in nature.
Yeah, kind of putting the house in order, in a sense.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, it's inspired AIs that actually operate on this principle as well, and it seems to help their learning
I didn't
process.
know that.
Yeah. The so-called sleep-wake learning cycle, yeah. I personally am not convinced that that's the entire story based on my own experience, just because some of the dreams that I and others have had seem to give me really surprising insights into my personal life and seem to be, I've even had a dream that seemed to predict something that actually happened in my life in the future, and I can't really make sense of that. Yeah. So I'll close, I guess, by saying that I look forward to finding out.
You close with a almost a teaser.
Exactly.
Because that seems like a very interesting story. And you can interpret, I mean, obviously you can interpret it in a transcendental way, but you can interpret it in terms of your brain finding patterns that you're not consciously aware of. But anyway, I've had you in this inquiry long enough, so let's go for the book.
The book that I chose is called Psychotherapy East and West by Alan Watts. And it was published in the early 70s. Alan Watts is someone who's quoted often in various songs and YouTube videos. It turns out that he's a scholar who's read very deeply both in psychoanalysis over the 20th century as well as Zen Buddhism. And so he draws from these two lineages of inquiry into the workings of the mind. And in this book, he tries to get at the question of how do Eastern and Western approaches of psychology help us in the problems of man. And what he posits is that both of these traditions, the Eastern and the Western tradition, see the human being as someone who is trapped in a game with no answer. So because we are living in a world of contradictions where we are citizens that are free to behave how we like, and we are expected to have responsibility, this would be an example of a contradiction in some sense, we are doomed to not find a unifying answer. And so in his mind, both of these processes, working with a therapist or in a Zen practice, allow you to see the contradictions of the game that we're embedded in and recognize it as just that, thereby freeing us from the contradictory chains of existence.
I'm looking forward to reading the book. I was actually checking; it's from 1975, so it's a classic almost. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, Gautam, thanks a lot, man.
Thank you so much.
Gostaram deste episódio? Se encontram valor no 45 graus, existem várias formas de contribuir para a continuidade deste projeto. Podem avaliá-lo na aplicação que utilizam, seja ela o iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher ou outra, e podem também partilhá-lo com amigos e comentá-lo nas vossas páginas ou redes sociais. Se acharem mesmo que merece e puderem fazê-lo, podem ainda tornar-se mecenas deste podcast através do Patreon ou do PayPal. Com esse apoio estão a contribuir para a viabilidade deste projeto, que passa a ser também um bocadinho vosso. Para além disso, obtêm em troca vários benefícios, como por exemplo o acesso ao backstage do podcast e também a possibilidade de sugerir perguntas aos convidados. No fim do dia, já se sabe, são os ouvintes que tornam possível um projeto destes. Ouvintes como Gustavo Pimenta, João Vitor Baltazar, Salvador Cunha, Ana Mateus, Nelson Teodoro, Paulo Ferreira, Duarte Dória, Gonçalo Martins, entre outros mecenas, a quem agradeço e cujos nomes podem encontrar na descrição deste episódio. Até à próxima!